His voice echoes through my conscience, over and over again. I remember his face was a sickly yellow color. The corners of his mouth were veiled with blood. The sound of the air pacemaker was just as I imagined it would sound. The oropharyngeal airway stuck out from the corner of his mouth was clear, flexible tubes in his arm, the catheter, and the noiseless nurses repeatedly coming in and out of the room wearing teal and blue scrubs. His chest rose and fell in jagged cycles like a conveyor belt ready to give out. He looks like a Holocaust victim, as my dad would say. I was in agony seeing him in this condition. It was not my brother I was seeing. What I'd seen was something no human should ever have to bear witness. The staff at the hospital told us he would not be leaving his hospital bed alive. My mother fell into her chair and began to weep. As we sat with him, we simply could not bear to watch him suffer any longer. If we remove the pacemaker and ease back the dopamine, he'll be able to hear your voices. However, if we do that, he will most likely die within minutes, the doctor said. If that is what you wish. We wanted it to all be over with. All of it. My father nodded and gave her permission to proceed. When his eyes finally opened, I felt unwell. His eyes were just as yellow as his skin was. The blood vessels in his eyes were touched to fire. The struggle, the gasps for air, and the suffering on his face filled me with contempt and resentment towards everything in existence. I cursed God. I damned him for everything. I damned all the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. We love you, Brian. We will always be a family of 5, my father said. Finally, his face went slack and his body became still. The doctor came in and checked his vitals. His eyelids were slightly parted. I could still see a sickly yellow color in his eyes. She looked up at my mother with a disdainful look that made my heart sink all the way down to my belly. I'm sorry, he's passed, she said. I grabbed hold of my mother and brought her close to my chest the way she did for me when I was young. We stood there and she sobbed in my arms for the longest time. Just like yesterday, he was gone. My whole family wept. But for some unknown reason, I could not. I did not understand why. I should have been crying like a travailing woman, but I didn't. Instead, I knelt down beside his bed and clutched his hand for a little while, just wanting to feel him one last time. His body was still warm. I could feel the life that had once coursed through him, not the cold, stiff, synthetic feeling it would have been being caked with embalming fluid. I leaned in and kissed his forehead. I'll always love you, and you'll always be my big brother, I whispered. I can't speak for elsewhere, but here on Earth there is a fair supply of everything. We manufacture chairs, transistors, scissors, teacups, and dams. There are the goods in life, clothes fresh out of the dryer, singing in the shower, breaking perforated seals, or just about anything, peeling a clementine in just one peel, a perfectly popped bag of popcorn, seeing a woman slip into a pair of jeggings, when the Starbucks barista spells your name right, a box of corgi puppies. The world is filled with these things, but it is also filled with the bad stuff. House fires, thoughts of suicide, divorce, cancer, the New York Stock Exchange, and Rupert Murdoch. For me, the bad stuff never seemed to end. But one solemn day in October, I saw how much worse things could get. Things turned for the worst imaginable. On this day, death was rapping away at my door, asking for me. October 25th. It had been a little more than a year since that night at the hospital. That day I'd been driving for longer than I can remember. The East was not wedged with apartment complexes, gridlocked traffic jams, and boisterous barking dogs. Freetown was an urban area which resembled something of a colonial painting. The town itself lied on the southeast region of Bristol County. Most of the houses were built with vinyl sidings. There were newly paved roads and families walking hand in hand down the sidewalk. I looked at the navigation system on my phone. I was just a few miles away. Turn left on Sesame Seed Avenue, then follow for 3/4 of a mile, it broadcasted. The closer I got, the less people I saw. Residents in these parts were more spread out than others elsewhere in this neck of the country. But when I got closer to the woods border, it became more perceptible to me. I drove up the four-way intersection and came across a very old, tumble-down wood sign settled just off the side of the road with the words, Wampanoag Indian Reservation. The paint was eroded by years of rainfall and other attributes. Then I noticed a fallen marker sign with the words inscribed on it, Freetown State Forest, 1.5 miles. The sign was corroded with rust and overgrown in moss, but it was still legible enough to read. Odd, no one tried to fix it, I thought. You would think a town would at least try to replace it. They did not. A few minutes go by and I came up to a small shopette. Main Street Market. It looked like an establishment out of a pioneer era. The 20 by 10 market fortified with chicory sidings and hitching posts out in front. The only thing that was missing was a billboard sign mounted above the store's entrance titled Guns, Pistols, Ammunition, Hardware, and Tinware. And a little subnote that said, Guns and Pistols Repaired. There was a neon sign advertising Coors Light fizzing away in the window. I thought it would be wise to stock up on snacks and maybe a spare set of batteries. I pulled into the dirt lot. My vehicle rose and fell like an ocean current, kicking up clouds of dust. The lot was completely empty, no sign of other vehicles, not even the store owner's vehicle. But the sign clearly read, Open. When I walked in, I found myself greeted by a man with a shit-eating grin who looked like he had just crawled out of the bottle of gin. His face was old and haggard, and his skin was as white as blossoms on an almond tree. He whistled an indistinct melody, the likes of which I'd never heard before. The tune was rather daunting, as if forewarning its listeners about something. He wore a blue smock, brandishing the store's logo on it. Another man with similar features was in the far corner stocking shelves with cans of pickled okra. The room had a strange aroma to it. It reminded me of moldy Roquefort cheese. Odd, but more pleasant than one might think. Hi there, the man exclaimed. Not being rude, I replied with, Hello, sir, while offering a tentative smile. The man grinned widely at my response. What can I do you for, son? Just looking for a few things is all. Yeah, let me know if you need any help, okay? Yes, sir, I replied. Our conversation following that introduction would not be so pleasant. 50 minutes pass by, and I gather what provisions I feel I would need for my journey. I return to the counter where the old store clerk was posted. What's your name, son? The man asked. Scott, I replied. Scott Connors. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Connors. The man's accent was very thick. It was the accent of your standard Eastern New Englander. He extended one hand over the counter in an effort to shake my hand, like what most men in this part of the world do when making introductions. I grasped his hand. They were just as worn and damaged as his face was, and his fingernails were yellowed, probably from years of smoking Rothman Royals. I could tell he was a smoker. The moment I walked up to the counter, I immediately picked up on the scent of nicotine. The man was a walking ashtray. Name's Rich. Richard Wright. But people call me Dick for short, he replied. Nice to meet you, Mr. Wright. Never seen you around these parts before, son, and I'm one to notice a face when I've seen it a time or two. I'm originally from a little town out west called South Hadley. Never heard of it. Not too many people have, I replied. What brings you all the way out here to Bridgewater Triangle, he asked. I saw no harm in his question. I felt no reason not to tell him, so I did. Just taking a little excursion on my day off. I like to hike, especially this time of year, with all the foliage. He glanced at me while he packaged my items. I thought it'd be nice to go on a little trek through Freetown Forest. The sound of falling canned items from one of the shelves behind me caught my attention. When I looked over my shoulder, I noticed the other man sprawling out onto the floor to retrieve the fallen canned items. The look on his face was one I will not forget. It was one of abysmal frozen horror. A bemused look dawned on my face. When I turned back to Mr. Wright, I found the expression on his face was one much similar to that of the other man's. At first I could not explain the livid terror which had dropped over the faces of them at the moment. Mr. Wright stared down at me from behind the counter. He looked at me like I had tree branches growing out of my ears. The pallor on this man's face was uncommonly difficult to explain. Now what business does a young'un like yourself have going out into those woods? He asked me. I've been searching for something. No treasure or any fiddle-faddle of that sort, just searching for some closure is all. He rubbed the stubby wattles of his chin. I could see he was searching for the correct way to tell me something rather important. Being a stranger and all, there was always some folklore the old-timers in this neck of the woods had to tell any passerby or outsiders was perhaps the more preferred terminology people had for us these days. This wasn't my first experience being an outsider. Every time my family and I went to eat at Fishtails in Watley, we were always greeted by a room full of unpleasant facial expressions. People from that region did not take too kindly to anyone who was from outside the area, or was not one of German or Polish descent. Son, I promise you, there ain't nothing out in those woods worth visiting. It's just a bad place. What are you getting at, old-timer? There are places in the woods where strangers seem to gravitate, and this is one of them, he replied. People go missing in those woods all the time and never turn up. It's like they walked off the face of the earth. How can that be? I asked him skeptically. I can't say whether it's the topography, geography, or just some other enigmatic power that causes these things, but they just keep happening. Well, old-timer, you got my attention. So why don't you tell me what lives in Freetown Forest? I said, sounding somewhat condescending, but the old-timer overlooked my pompous behavior for more important things that were happening here. He exchanged glances with the man from across the room for a moment, then returned his gaze towards me. I hate this, but it's got to be done, he said and then sighed. It was a sigh of a man who had set down a heavy burden and knows he must pick it back up again. Evil, my boy, he said sharply. A short silence befell the room. I thought for a moment the old man was having me on, but then I realized by the look in his eyes that he was as serious as the fifth act of tragedy. Originally, this here land belonged to the Wampanoag, or Wampanoag, or whatever they call it. The Wampanoag? I asked. With one finger, the old-timer pointed at me and shook it vigorously with approval. That's the one, he said. The Wampanoag Tribe, in the early days of the New World, the Wampanoag Tribe was driven from these parts. Rumors floated around that this town was settled on an old Indian reservation. They say the valley is cursed or something. Just a plethora of unexplained occurrences happening from time to time. The place has just a foul aura about it. I've heard the stories. I could hear just how sardonic my voice sounded. Have you been told about the murder of Mary Lou Arruda in '78? He asked. I shook my head. I can't say I have. The name did sound familiar, as I feel I would recognize the name such as Mary Lou Arruda. November 1978, that poor girl was found tied to a tree. Her killer beat her within an inch of her life, then just left her for the wolves. Autopsy said when she lost consciousness, the weight of her body caused stress on her neck and ensuing asphyxiation. They ever find out who did it? Fortunately, yes. A man by the name of James Cater, donut maker in Raynham, Massachusetts. It wasn't the first, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. There are other things crawling around in those woods. I would not venture there alone or after dark. Well, Mr. Wright, I'm all ears, I said. There I go again with a condescending tone of mine. I just can't help myself, can I? About 10 years ago, two young backpackers were hiking along the Haskell Path when a tree gave way. The roots must have gone sour. That thing came tumbling down on top of both of them, killing them instantly. When the firefighters managed to lift the damn thing off them, it looked like a steamroller had plowed over these poor bodies. The funeral parlor had, really to make services, closed casket. Then just 6 years back, Maggie Lawrence, over on Bolton Avenue, lost her dog, Chipper, in those woods. 3 weeks later, he turns up on her front doorstep, bloody to a pulp and mad with disease. He came back not the friendly cohort she raised, but an abomination whose only intentions were to rip her throat out. The thing wreathed with odious stench. Maggie says he smelled like something that had been festering out in the hot sun for too long, like decaying flesh or something. Animal control came by and put 2 rounds in old Chipper's head, but a minute later, the damn dog got back up and started charging the fella who shot him. Poor son of a bitch lost an eye. It took 2 men to pull that damn thing off of him. They put 2 more rounds in its head when they cremated the body. I don't know very much, son, but I do know something goes down after 2 slugs in the temple. That is just not something of this world. Then again, a few years back, a family, I think their name was Fitzgerald or something, and their 3 kids. He pronounced 3 like tree. Came through looking for stuff for a family hike. I remember the children so vividly. The eldest name was Mark, the middle was Alex, and there was the youngest, Brianna, he said as a look of despondency dawned on his face for that moment. Sweet little angel she was. I told the father about that place, like I'd done with you, but he wouldn't have any of it. What happened? I asked, now intrigued by the old-timer's stories. 2 hours went by. I was getting ready to close up the shop when the father kicked in the door with his little girl in his arms. Her head hung like a dying flower when he carried her. Her eyes were wide and her body was swollen all over. That wrinkled look on his face worsened the more he spoke. She'd fallen into a pit of rattlers. Rattlers? I thought questionably. Oh, you mean rattlesnakes? I asked. That's what I mean. Rattlers, he replied. Poor child was bitten from head to toe and died from the venom before the parents had a chance to get her to the car. I sighed. It was a tragedy nonetheless, and I knew a thing or two about tragedies. Well, I replied, I think I should be safe from rattlers. The cold this time of year has surely driven them underground till spring. The devil's pawns also occupy them woods. Devil's worshippers, Satanists, and, as I like to call them, wackadoodles. People see them every now and again, the night and the light of their fires, committing strange and unspeakable deeds. The wickedness from that place draws them to it. I'll be cautious about where I go, sir. You best also be bringing protection with you. People usually do, especially when they go walking around before sunset. You hear strange noises after sundown. What kind of strange noises? Sounds like crying, you're wailing coming from the treetops. Locals who live nearby thinking maybe it was the Pukwudgie is close by doing a bit of swift traveling. And what is the Pukwudgie, pray? I asked, a bit irritated because I could not prevent the sudden shiver of nerves when I mentioned the word itself. I knew I was close upon the man's terror and the cause of it. Just an old wives' tale they usually tell around campfires and lumber camps back when I was a boy. Nothing but what those lousy fellers believe when they've been hitting the whiskey bottle a little too hard. Sort of great animal that lives up yonder, he said, jerking his head northwards. Quicker than lightning in its tracks, smaller than most that lives in the bush, but is said to be very dangerous. And ain't supposed to be too good to look at is all. The old-timer sighed, this time sounding a bit flustered, and he took out a pack of Rothman Royals from his blouse pocket. He packed them, took one out, and put it between his lips. He continued to speak while he searched for his lighter. Don't let him catch you, son. If it does, it'll split you open, mouth to anus, and wear your skin like a raincoat. I tittered at his remarks, thinking this was child's play the old-timer should have just grown out of years ago. For a moment, nothing else was said. I just looked at the old man, contemplating whether he was a gifted liar or whether he had a few marbles rolling around upstairs. He found his lighter, lit the end portion, and drew deeply on it. I've heard it all before, and I must say, all of it is more far-fetched than I could have imagined. I continued snickering, but the old-timer just stood there, not amused by my lack of seriousness. Maybe it is, he said. I could tell by the look on his face that none of my previous experiences would tread water against what lied in the store for me. But I've lived here since it was just flatland and dirt roads, and in that time I've learned to keep an open mind. I nodded at his remark, accepting him for what he may believe is living or not living in these woods. You still intend on going, don't you? I do, I replied. I can see there's nothing I can say to change your mind. Listen carefully, son, said the old-timer. Stay on the trail. No matter what, do not float off the path, or else you'll be lost to those woods and never found. I could not take his warning seriously. These woods were not as vast as they once were. The forest couldn't have been more than 50 or 60 miles in size. It seemed very difficult to get yourself lost in there for all eternity. And stay away from the Hockomock Swamp. The mist in the marsh can tinker with your mind. I had heard rumors about the Hockomock Swamp. People around these parts refer to it as the Devil's Swamp. I'll wait at this counter till sundown. If you don't walk through that door, he said, pointing his crooked fingers to the doorway I entered, I'm calling the police chief and telling we got ourselves another transient who went sticking his nose where it didn't belong. I hear you, old-timer, I replied. I promise I'll be out of those woods and on the road again before dusk." But old Mr. Wright did not believe a word of it. He just stared at me with the stone-cold hazel eyes of his. As I walked out the door and back towards my car, the two men continued on with the conversation as I left. "You had no business letting him go," the other men said across the room. "There was nothing stopping him from going," Mr. Wright replied. "This is something he'll need to figure out on his own." He drew deep on his cigarette and held it for a moment or two. As he exhaled, an opaque cloud of smoke wafted across the room. "Boy's really brave, really stupid, though really ignorant. Or all of the above," Wright said. "I'd go with option D," the other man replied. "Typical millennial generation, am I right?" He giggled at his response. Old Wright looked over at the other man stacking cans of pickled okra and smiled a bit, but he did not laugh. Old Wright just stood leaned over on the counter, looking like he was coming down with a fever. In his eyes, you could see the fear looming inside of him. That may be the last anyone ever sees of that boy, he thought to himself. What kind of fool did he take me for? I asked myself. What a load of shit that was. The puckwudgie? I asked. Just the way it rolled off my tongue sounded wacky. A few more minutes in that place, I would have gone crazy like Casey Anthony. As I turned off onto an unpaved side road, a metal frame sign was posted up at the intersection. It read, "Cooped Road." The ground was eroded and still laved by the runoff from the rainfall the night before. The placid water splashed my windshield, leaving the field of sight veiled with an accumulation of lumpy mush. I continued driving, passing the occasional pickup truck veered off to the side of the road, and even a group of hikers marching along both sides of the road in staggered formation. It reminded me of an army ruck march. Make sure you're careful, and make sure you wear your neon strap around your backpack. It's turkey and pheasant season. Those woods will be teeming with hunters, my granddad told me the night before. I wasn't entirely sure what my reason for coming this far out of the way just to walk these trails was, but I knew it had something to do with Brian. I needed closure, and I knew I would not find that anywhere close to home. But what would I be proving by traveling out here? 3:26 p.m. I found a spot that looked rather promising. I parked my car off to the side of the road and loaded my backpack. Last-minute accountability check. A roast beef sandwich, 2 Special K pastry bars, 2 tangerines, a banana, a bottle of water, and a bottle of Powerade, a Nutri-Grain bar, a flashlight with a spare set of batteries, a spare pair of socks, my Vanguard buck knife, which I strapped to my belt for easy access, a portable med kit with a cylindrical canister of Raleigh antiseptic salve that I bought from the market. Lastly, there was my Smith & Wesson .38 snub-nosed revolver, or as the Golden Agers like to call, a lemon squeezer. While at this time, I was not swayed by Mr. Wright's outlandish ghost stories, I was still not one who liked to venture out on his own without a contingency plan. What's the old saying? The pessimist looks down and hits his head, while the optimist looks up and loses his footing, and the realist looks forward and adjusts his path accordingly. I took the revolver and tucked it into my back waistband for a quick access purpose. I looked and saw the marker sign hammered onto a tree trunk. It read, Hathaway Trail. There was no ulterior motive behind my choice. I just felt I was far enough away from people now and I could just be by myself. I started meandering down the trail's long path. I looked up and saw crisp copper leaves in the trees that swayed back and forth in the autumn wind. My cheeks were flushed red by the harsh cold, but it did not trouble me the least bit. At last, I thought, peace and quiet. Hours go by, and nothing thus far. I was beginning to think I was right about old Mr. Wright being off his rocker. The forest was content, all except for just barely audible noise of cars on the highway, meaning I wasn't entirely cut off from civilization. The clouds lingered overhead like schooners, sailing slowly above me, trailing their shadows like wakes. I came across an old '58 Plymouth Fury with most of its original character despite its rusted exterior. The vehicle's naturally red exterior was scorched by decades of rust. Its corroded color was like a carnelian, or perhaps more like a red velvet cake. What was once an extravagant piece of luxury was now just a piece of scenery reclaimed by nature and completely buried in foliage and pine straw. I then noticed something. It didn't mean anything at first, but it struck me as being out of place. It sounded like a tree branch snapping. Not a light snap, but more of a heavy break, like something forcing its weight down on top of a fallen limb. I looked over my shoulder and listened for a moment or two, and there was nothing after that. Perhaps it was just another hiker or an animal passing by, but it sounded too heavy to be anything like a possum or a raccoon. It had to be something fairly large, but I did not let the idea hang around my head for too long. I proceeded walking for a little while longer and then made haven on a board table of rock that was positioned up on a steep slope overlooking the lower basin. I could not see very much as the trees and undergrowth obstructed my view. Black bear and white-tailed deer once roamed this valley many decades ago. Nowadays, the black bear population had been depleted due to excess hunting, and while white-tailed deer were still native to this valley and places west of here, they were scarcer due to mankind's yearning for ownership of land. Places as far east were mostly colonized, so moments like these and places like this were in short supply these days. I unlatched my bag and took out a bottle of water. By the time I was done sipping the bottle, I had managed to drink nearly 3/4 of it. I then proceeded to eat one of the tangerines, the Nutri-Grain bar, and one of the Special K bars I brought along with me. I was about ready to eat my sandwich when I decided my appetite wasn't quite there yet. I rested my head against a slab of rock that protruded out from the hilltop. I leaned back and shut my eyes for a little. I wanted to catch my breath before I continued on. I set the timer on my phone to wake me up in about 15 minutes. I closed my eyes, and then I awoke to the sound of my alarm going off. The birds in the trees still sang confidently. The crows were cawing in a vexatious manner, and I felt as if I had just shut my eyes a few moments ago. But that was just a natural feeling of people when they're tired. While it was tempting to stay in that area for a little while longer to go on sleeping like Rip Van Winkle, I had places to be right then. I brushed myself off, shouldered my bag, and continued walking. I've been walking for a long time. By then, I had explored those woods for hours, searching for anything to substantiate its reputation for an unholy ambiance. Soon enough, I came across an open field, sheathed with what appeared to be barberry bushes. But I was not entirely certain. The crimson color reminded me of a burning field painting by a woman named Karen Goppert. I'd seen the painting once before, hanging at the Mount Holyoke Art Museum. Its vastness and ashy, murky colors were mesmerizing. It felt like there was some unknown force inside of me telling me to go take a walk. The next thing I knew, I was off the path and into the field of barberry bushes. Walking along, taking in all its beauty and splendor. Then again, my journey was interrupted. I heard what sounded like footfalls moving from just up ahead of me. It didn't sound like chipmunks. No. Whatever this was much too large to be any small game. A buck, maybe? Or a coyote, perhaps. But it sounded like bare feet galloping across the grubby forest floor. Something was definitely moving out there. Something big. The sound seemed to be emanating from the cover of tree branches about 20 yards ahead of me. I could not see anything as long as the tree trunks and branches thwarted my view. The trees were covered in dim shadows, allowing the interloper to move about unseen. I stood frozen to the ground for a minute, waiting, listening, and watching. Whatever it was, I was beyond certain it was still there, and it was still watching me. Hunkered down to the ground, staring at me with great intent. I slowly moved my hand back towards where my .38 was posted. I wrapped my fingers around the warm leather grip, tinkering with the hammer on its backside. I waited another moment till finally I drew the pistol out and fired one round into the air. The crash of the bullet cleared my eardrums and sounded like a rocket launch. I heard it again. The interloper was now moving away from me. Each passing second it retreated farther and farther back into the forest. I stood there for a minute, listening to the sounds of its footfalls against the underbrush and falling tree branches. Whatever it was gone now, I thought to myself. But what if it comes back? A wary voice in my head asked me. If it comes back, the next time I won't shoot up. 4:55 p.m. The sun was now falling over the Appalachian Mountains. I was walking up a steep slope. The trails were swathed with trash. Starbucks, styrofoam coffee cups, bags of Lay's potato chips, Doritos, Fritos, and candy wrappers. There was graffiti on some of the rocks that jutted out from the hillside, some rather insightful and some rather cliché. One piece of scripture that stood out to me was a message on a boulder embedded into the hillside that read, "We are infinite." I could not help but laugh aloud. I thought it was a sort of impractical thing to write. Kids will say anything to sound insightful these days. While the quote was very ambiguous, I had my ideas as to what the writer was projecting to his readers. Kids these days thinking there is nothing that they cannot achieve, that they were limitless, impossible to measure. It was all just a load of rubbish. Nothing in this world lasts forever, and nothing in this world is perfect. I should know that better than most people, but I digress. I walked along listening to the sounds of the birds in the treetops. The crickets were itching their legs into the autumn humming, and frogs were throat-swollen like ladies with goiters shouting up into the evening sky in the occasional rattling pitch of a woodpecker. And suddenly I felt a coldness in my veins. A loud wailing sound came up from up ahead. As soon as I heard it, I teared up. Consider me pussy, but I knew something was approaching me from uphill. Not an animal or a person, but a sound that seemed rather distinct, but was closing in fast. It was moving so fast that I would expect to see the origin at any moment. There was no grotesque shape or large, unthought-of beast, but instead a maniacal laughter flew down from the hillside in frenzied cycles. I could hear the voice in the wind calling my name. It was so close now, and I feel as if the origin of the laughter was without form, no embodiment to call home, just a loud and sharp voice that might make an incriminating shadow along the seam of my pants. I listened to the sound as it moved all around me. The wind began to pick up speed. Heaps of leaves drew out from the forest and flew right past me. The revolver, tucked into my belt loop, felt useless now. The voice rose and fell into a guttural chuckling before it faded out altogether. In that moment, I felt as if I'd just seen, or heard what was perhaps the more suitable way to describe it, a poltergeist. The cold laughter was gone, and the monotonous whine of the wind returned. I struggled as a wad of spit lodged itself in my throat. My chest rose in jagged cycles as I forced out a murky yellow wad of lung butter onto the rocky surface. I stood staring stolidly into the abyss of the woods, asking myself what it was that I just saw happen. Then I decided to not let Old Man Wright's fairy tales get the best of me. "A loon," I said. "She's just a loon." "A loon," a voice inside my head asked me. "At this time of year?" "Yeah," I whispered. "Just a flock of them in their annual migration south to Carolina or Georgia, maybe." The sky was painted with mahogany, orange and purple as the sun drowned in the horizon. The clouds held the promise of a calm and peaceful night. It's time to start heading back. I looked down at my wristwatch and doubled back for a second when I realized the time was incorrect. My watch said 3:25 p.m., but there was no way that could be true. Damn thing's broken again, I told myself. But I didn't falter. I reached for my phone in my back pocket. Unfortunately, I was all out of juice there. Just one problem after another. I was a man in the woods without any way of telling time or any form of communication. No matter. I'll just double back the way I came and I'll eventually hit the main road. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. I was nowhere closer to where I'd parked my car. Everything looked the same. The night sky loomed in the far distance. My heart ached when I realized that I had not seen any mile markers or any sign of people for at least an hour. I found myself inadvertently peering back over my shoulder from time to time, as if I hoped to find a man in a black hood or cassock standing behind me. After all, the old timer mentioned the devil pawns occupied these here woods. Had there been any? Surely I would have seen them by now, wouldn't I? A million follow-up questions grazed across my mind. My brain was so rattled that I couldn't tell which way was up and which way was down. I stopped on the trail for just a sec. I unstrapped my sack and began to dig through it. A large word in neon red letters lit up inside my mind at this point, and it was the word Eureka. I found the flashlight I brought with me. I turned it on. Its radiance exceeded my expectations. I proceeded down the slope. The forest was now without sound, and while it struck me as being odd, it didn't put a damper on my confidence. I was still not convinced there was anything supernatural going on in Freetown Forest. I was worried, but I remembered looking at a map before I came out here, and on the map I remember there was a brook somewhere nearby, Rattlesnake Brook. The thing I remembered most from my survival training in the Army was if you ever find yourself lost in the woods and you do not have access to a compass, a map, a protractor, or a pencil, then search for running water. Running water always leads to the ocean. Where there is an ocean, there is civilization. And where there is civilization, there is people. I felt as if my confidence was restored. Shouldn't be too hard to find. All I have to do is be patient and listen for running water. My field of vision grew dim, and I was losing the light quickly. Then I heard something. Something I felt I should not hear this far out in the woods. It sounded like laughter, like a child's laughter. I turned it in a 180 spin. Where was it coming from? I asked myself. Is someone there? I called out shyly, but no one replied. Then, just up ahead, something entered my peripheral vision. A blurry mix of gray and white ran from one side of the path to the other. It moved on all fours like a chimp, but the thing I remembered definitively about it were its 3 bony fingers on each hand passing through the bush. I'd never seen my own 2 feet work like they did that day. I began sprinting in the opposite direction, howling with uncontrollable fright. I went off the trail and started fumbling through the tree branches and thorn bushes. I did my best to keep up the speed of my pace. I was moving faster than an old maid trying to catch a bridal bouquet. As the bush thickened, I soon couldn't tell which direction I was running now. My pant leg got caught only for a moment or two, but I managed to shimmy myself free and kept moving. I saw an opening just up ahead where the darkened sky peered down on top of me. I jolted through these bushes and then leapt out into the open. But when I realized I was not standing in a field, my heart sank. I felt as if I stepped in some runoff from a sewage pipe. The stench hit me first, the mixture of something rotten and something dead. I'd realized I had stepped into a bog. The mist draped itself around my knees. The ground was loose and moist. My feet had sunken maybe 10 inches into the loose, grime-ridden earth. I struggled to lift my ankles out from the mud, a loud suction noise followed by an outward rupture of mire and grunge as I pulled my feet free from the earth's grasp. I lost my balance only for a moment, but it was enough to send me tumbling backwards into the tree line. I felt like a bottle of suds that was shook too hard. I felt as if my mind fabricated everything out of thin air. Sheer desperation or another part of me took pleasure in watching me struggle, feeding off my anxiety. There was no more containing it. I was frightened and I was lost. God damn it, I yelled. Ah, Jesus, help me find the Alps. What do you want from me? It wasn't until afterwards I discovered I had stepped into the Hockomock swamp. Something overcame me. I felt fatigued all of a sudden, as if I just ran the Boston Marathon. My eyesight doubled. I shook my head, trying hard not to pass out. A regiment of black cloths clouded my vision. I could feel myself beginning to tip backwards. My stomach felt bilious. This was a fight between me and my stomach, and I was losing badly. Remember what the old-timer said. The mist in the marsh tinkers with your mind. I had to get out of that place, and quickly. Had I stayed there any longer, I would have fainted and fallen face first into the marsh and would be a late-night snack for whatever came passing by. I turned back and tried to find my bearings, but I froze when I saw it. The hell is that? I asked myself. An animal, my conscience replied. The thing was tangled in the weeds and the forest undergrowth. I moved cautiously towards it. It's dead. It was a deer at one point, but now it was just a memory. It was split open like a piñata. Its face was half gone. A whole section was torn out from its chest. Its ribs were picked clean. Its entrails lay on the ground, partly eaten. The blood was hardened and black like a woodchuck's asshole. Its eyes. What happened to its eyes? I thought. In the place where its eyes should have been were 2 vacant black holes. It took its eyes. This wasn't hunger. This was instinct. This was rage, a raspy voice in my head replied. Abomination was the first word that came to mind. Only something so horrible could do something so evil. Then I began to contemplate what might have actually been the wrongdoer in this act. A coyote, I considered it for a minute, but I knew right away I was wrong. No, not a coyote. Coyotes don't do this. A lynx, if large enough perhaps? Then I heard an indistinct voice join in the conversation. It was a voice I had no association with before in my life. The voice sounded prim and proper with an icy undertone that was overflowing with pique.
You know what did this,
the cold voice replied.
It's been watching you.
There's no such thing as a puckwudgie, I said. It would continue to repeat myself over and over and over and over again.
Must we play games, my inquisitive friend? We both know that you're lying to yourself. It takes their eyes so that no one can bear witness to its vaulting appearance.
Why don't you just piss off already? I said, trying to shoo away the voice. Just like that, it left. Did not put up much of a fight. Perhaps my frustration was enough to drive it off. But it would be back. That much I was certain. It would let me win this round, but it would be back. Beside the animal's remains in the marsh, I saw what appeared to be a deep impression, like something on all fours had bolted off. They proceeded northward in the opposite direction from which I'd come. Whatever it was, since moved on elsewhere. Lord knows whatever mauled this deer may come back. Let the meat ripen some before it comes back to finish off the leftovers. The sun was almost entirely gone now, and I was still no closer to finding my way out of this forsaken place. As I moved further and further away from the marsh, I felt my vision begin to restore itself. The mesh of knots in my stomach vanished, but I did not feel well again, for in the back of my mind I knew something was with me back there in the bog. I could not shake the feeling that I was under surveillance, that something was definitely watching me carefully from the trees. I managed to find my way back to one of the trails, but with there being very little daylight left over from the afternoon, I could not tell if I was going the right way, back towards the road, or the wrong way, further into the forest. My light flickered a time or two, the batteries were beginning to die, but I was in no real danger of losing the light just yet, for I was wary enough to purchase an extra set of batteries back at the Main Street Market before coming into these woods. It may have been the best decision I've made thus far in my day, or possibly the remainder of my life, I thought to myself. I stopped along the trail, when I moved away from my mind and took a moment to listen to the sounds of the woods. I was startled when I realized there was no sound. The sound of birds in the trees, branches were gone, as well as the delicate movement of squirrels and chipmunks moving into the bushes. To the untrained eye, or ear, that seemed like nothing. But to a man such as me, nature does not go quiet unless there is something foreboding nearby. I opened the cylinder to my .38 and checked to make sure I got a good count of the number of rounds I had used. 4 unused rounds still loaded in the cylinder, along with 5 more spares I had tucked away in my front right pocket. I closed the cylinder and held the gun at a low and ready. I kept my finger outside of the trigger guard. I did not want to risk startling myself and inadvertently wasting a round. I had only 9 casings left, so I had to make them count. I lifted the flashlight and pointed it ahead. Then to the trail behind me, something moved. I whirled around with the flashlight and pointed it down the trail, and the revolver this time at a ready with my finger wrapped over the trigger. I was caught off guard by a man standing in the middle of the path about 10 yards back. His arms were folded. He wore a long black cassock and a hood like those of the satanic cultists old Wright had talked about. Was this one of them? I asked myself. Is this one of the cultists Mr. Wright spoke of? Who are you? I yelled. The man did not reply. He just stood there staring at me unresponsively through the black hood. Show yourself, I demanded. Let me see your face. I was now blaring orders at my concealed visitor. The man did not step forward, nor did he speak. He merely withdrew his pale white hands from his sleeves of his cassock and pulled back the cover from his face. When I finally saw what lay beneath the hood, the hand which wielded the revolver fell to my side. What I saw beneath the hood was something I could not fathom. It was the face of my deceased brother Brian. It can't be, I whispered. The man in the cassock said nothing. He just continued staring at me. But I saw you die, I said to the man. The woods were silent. The light in the sky was now gone and had turned to a perpetual gray. The gentle wind blew up piles of leaves and dancing dervishes. Who the hell are you? My voice no longer demanding, but was enraged. You can't be him. So tell me who you are. Finally, the man in the cassock spoke. Not with the same voice as my late brother, but with the same cold voice that had spoken to me earlier in the back of my mind.
I am the keeper of this place.
The voice was just as prim and proper as before, but it did not sound so hateful like before.
I've lived in these woods for a very long time.
Why do you look like my brother? I asked.
I had to take a form of someone you knew. I can appear as others if you like,
said the man in the cassock. Don't, I replied. While it was rather difficult to see his face again, it did me some good, seeing that he was in good health and without the sickish yellow tinge he wore on his skin in his final days. What do you want with me? Are you the reason I'm lost? I asked.
I have not, nor have I been, responsible for such ill-will acts,
the man replied.
As you've seen, I am not the only one who dwells within these woods. I am, how you might say, the warden here, the custodian, the curator, the guardian, or simply the keeper of the woods,
the man in the cassock said in a resentful tone.
There are other spiteful spectators that live in these woods. You should have listened to the old-timer. This place is cursed.
I felt as if I were on the verge of crying, but my pride was every bit as important to me as the life which I held dearly to right then. Whether this man was real or not, bawling in front of others was truly degrading in my opinion. I could not remember the last time I cried in front of others. Not since I was young was my supposition. Not at the wake, or the funeral, or any other event following, or even the night when the pain hurt the most.
That is what brought you here. Whether you believe in them or not, you came here because of the reputation this forest holds. You may say that it's all rubbish, but before you answer that, remember who you're speaking to.
While I wanted to deny his claims, I could not lie to the man in the cassock. If he truly was what he says he was, then lying to him would be as useful as a screen door in a submarine. I wanted to see if the myths were real or not, I said in a husky, whining whisper. I just wanted proof that there was something after this life, but...
But you did not anticipate that your speculations would be true,
the man interjected. I breathed deeply, then asked the man, "What is it? The thing in the woods? The thing that's been stalking me?" The man in the cassock stared phlegmatically at me for a moment or two, and then replied,
"It was once human."
I felt my heart skip a beat when he spoke. The thought of whatever it was out there, and the thought that it was once human frightened me dearly.
Now, it's just a thing in the woods.
"Will it kill me?" I asked, now feeling as if I was on the brink of falling onto the cold dirt path and began crying.
"Perhaps,"
the man said questionably, as if not sure of what the answer was himself. "Is there any hope for me?"
"Perhaps."
"Damn it, is that all you can say to me?" The man did not reply this time. He continued staring at me intently. Everything went quiet again for a moment, and then he began to speak.
"Why have you not visited him?"
"What?"
"Your brother's grave. You haven't visited it since the funeral."
"Is this why you're here? You're here to chastise me?"
"No,"
the man replied.
"I simply want your answer, and I'll decide."
"Decide on what?" I asked. To this, the man made no reply. I looked at him till my face turned red, and then decided not to waste any more time. I don't know," I said as if on the verge of tears. I've asked myself that same question so many times, and so many times I come back with nothing. I feel as if I'm a bad person. How can a person love someone when there are no tears worth shedding? Parts of me resent myself because of it. I wished I had sobbed like a little boy at his funeral. I wish I could release all the hate I should feel. But instead, I feel like a hollow shell, just an empty space on the inside. We stood for a moment without saying anything. "Now," I replied, "are you satisfied?"
"Yes,"
the man replied. "Now tell me, what is your answer?" The man went for the longest time without saying anything. I thought I would have to yell at the top of my lungs, but he finally said to me,
"No,"
he replied. "No?" I asked.
"My answer is no. I cannot help you."
"But you said—"
"I said I would hear your story. That does not mean that I would be the one to help you. Whether you survive or not is not up to me, son. That is up to you,"
he said, pointing one pale finger towards me.
"I can't guarantee that the beast will stay away, or that the vengeful spirits in this place will stay at bay. But in the end, the decision falls on you."
The more I listened, the more I felt I was speaking to my brother again, and not some manifestation of a man in a black cassock.
"What happens is between you and him."
"Who?" I asked.
"Him."
He pointed to the sky. I looked up anticipating that I'd find the answer above me, but all I could see was the dark blue atmosphere. Then I realized what he meant. "You're talking about the big man upstairs?"
"To me, he has no name. It's simply just him."
I laughed at his response. The last time I spoke to him for a favor, my brother died, so I do my best to stay out of his way.
"I understand your animosity. Humans are so vindictive when a tragedy befalls of them. Soul's journey of one is grace and pure misery. The cosmos guides us and nurtures us, like a loving parent."
For a man who resembles a cultist, he seems so gentle.
"But the parent knows the value of tough love. Often it leads us to a place that brings us suffering, and where that suffering can deepen our wisdom. And it is perfectly willing to allow us to make irrational decisions, which can lead to unbearable outcomes. Do you understand what I mean, son?
I did not respond to his question, though. The Keeper of the Woods, I thought to myself. I had so many questions I wanted to ask, but the next thing I remember, I was laying against a tree trunk off the side of the trail. It was just a dream, I told myself. An hour, maybe an hour and a half had gone by, no doubt. The sky was pitch black, and my flashlight flickered more frequently than before. Before I proceeded with anything else, I quickly took out the spare set of Duracell AA batteries and replaced the ones in my flashlight. I felt comforted by the idea that the man in the black cassock was never real. However, I was not fully convinced that it was a dream. For no matter how hard I tried, I could not remember falling asleep. I could not remember resting, hardly seemed like the right time for it. I could not remember any break in my consciousness, and it didn't feel like a dream. That was what worried me the most. Suddenly, the stillness of the forest was shattered by the most uncommon sounds. It came without warning or audible approach and ricocheted through the pine tops. It was a voice, no doubt, a voice that was almost human gruff yet despondent. It was a soft, roaring voice overhead in the trees rather than on the ground. The sound reminded me of the time my family and I went to Southwick Zoo and visited the lynx habitat. This voice was in some way resembling the sounds of those creatures. The voice rang out in 3 distant tones, and then all at once, they vanished. The sound was cut off like a phonograph needle lifted up from a recording. I spun around, my gun drawn, pointing in every direction. These sounds were awful and made me want to curl up in a ball and wait for someone to come and save me. But no one would save me now. There was no one else around but myself and the thing in the woods. A choked cry for help forced itself up into my throat, but nothing came out. The woods was perpetually silent again. But then a sound, not like before, came rushing from beside. A scrambling noise followed by the rustle of dry brush. Something was coming. Run, my mind told me. Run and keep running till you can't run no more. So I did. I ran with all my might up the past steep slope. The sound was ringing in my ears. It was all around me and it swarmed over me. My lungs were set afire by the exertion and my muscles began to ache and grind like cogs in an old machine. Till finally, I could run no more. I could not stand upright. The weight of my bag in conjunction with the terrain tired me out more quickly than I had anticipated. The sound, the awful sound, still rang in my ears like wind chimes. But wind chimes played a pleasant jingle. The sound of this beast was lamentable. Then a new sound followed the screeching, a loud and vile cackle. It was in the trees, laughing maniacally, savoring every moment, letting the meat mellow in fear before gorging on the flesh like a dog gnawing on a piece of steak. The things in the woods were catching up to me quickly. I tried to catch my breath and keep moving forward. Unfortunately, I did not notice the tree root jutting out from the ground at my feet. I put 1 foot forward, then to my surprise, the next thing I knew, I was falling forward. My hands were flailing through the air as I tumbled over onto the gravel path. The pain was excruciating. My ankle was filled with fire and ice. I felt like a swarm of wasps was stinging me all at once. The thing climbed through the trees. I could hear it hobbling forward like a man with a bad limp. My flashlight had fallen out of my reach and my pistol was lost somewhere in the dark now. I was vulnerable and unarmed. I picked up a stone and threw it into the bush, hoping to strike the beast hard enough to drive it away, but I missed. I scrabbled around, searching for more stones. I continued chucking one after the other into the blackness, one after another, missing my target. I ran out of stones to pitch. As they say, I ran out of ammo. Then at length of the darkness, having thus laboriously conceived, brought forth an obscure figure. It drew forth into the uncertain light, where light and shadows mingled not 6 feet away. Then it halted and stared down at me. In an instant, it started forward again, with the spasmodic motions of a puppet being moved on wires. The thing couldn't be more than 3, maybe 3.5 feet in height. Its hands and its feet were unusually large for its body. Its skin was pale white, like a ghost's. Its blackened teeth and broken stubs, they resembled old tombstones. It was mostly white and bones, but with a savage bundle of muscles in all the right places. I attempted to crawl away and build space between me and the thing, but it stepped out of the bush and onto the trail. Its back right legs were gnarly and misshapen. Clearly signs of a gunshot wound, probably from some hunter's round, which was unfortunate enough to strike it through the heart. God in heaven, I whispered. I froze. I could not scream. I tried to bellow out a shout for help, but nothing came up. It rushed forward towards me. With the use of my left foot, I booted it in the face. A fresh film of blood spat out from the corner of its mouth. Now it was more riled than before. I tried bringing my foot forward again, but it leapt on top of me. I could feel its icy fingers against my belly's bare skin. I tried to wriggle myself free of its touch, but it was stronger than appeared. Its fingernails were long and uneven. They grazed against my skin before I felt a sharp penetration, followed by the odd smell of iron and pennies and a warm, runny matter trickling down my abdomen. Am I dying? I thought. Is this how it ends for me? I felt its warm breath on my face and on the dip of my neck. This made my hair stand up on end. Its mouth began to open, and with one free hand, I reached for my knife. I ripped the blade from its sheath and brought it forward into its left thigh. Blood flew all over. Its blood was different, some kind of dark matter, somber gray like an overcast sky, and thick as molasses in December. The gun was too far out of reach. I forced myself to flip over onto my stomach. The thing in the woods mounted my back and began tearing away at the fabric and velcro of my bag, the violent thrashing as it dragged me across the ground. The straps of my bag were torn away from my shoulders, but its interest was not in me, but the bag. It searched through every crevice, every compartment, as if it were searching for something in particular, till finally it pulled out a small, translucent plastic bag. It was still the sandwich I had packed for my trip. The meat, a voice in my head cried. This was my only chance. It took the bag in both hands covetously, and began tearing the meat and spitting out all the non-essentials. I scrambled for the gun, searching all over for it. I could hear its blunt teeth rip into the meat. The sounds of frenzied feeding and the appearance of an abomination behind me reminded me of George A. Romero's Fright Fest film, Night of the Living Dead. I could hear strangled cries of people in my head, the smell of decaying flesh in my nostrils, and I could see the mangled bodies of victims all over the ground. The sound of my heartbeat in my ears was like the thumbing wings of a caged bird. I yearned for the cold metallic cylinder of my weapon, praying for the feel of it somewhere. Next thing I knew, the thing was on me again. I could not fight back so well due to my ankle. It pulled me back towards it with one strong hand. It would paint the forest red with my blood. I cried out, screaming till my voice grew hoarse, my arms out by my sides looking for anything to grab hold of. That's when I felt it, the cold steel barrel of the revolver. With one last surge of energy, I forced the animal back and scrambled for my weapon. It came back at me, this time standing on two legs like a man, arms fanned out like a scarecrow, and that despicable cackle of it was the last thing I heard before the sound of the woods was replaced by a thunderous boom and an ear-shattering crack like lightning with a bright orange, red, and blue blaze that lit in the air. That ungodly scream. I did not hesitate. I fired 2 more rounds. In the wake of the light, I saw the animal driven backwards into the tree line. It cried out in agony. The sound of its scream was almost human. I wanted to shut it out, to cover my ears and wait for it to stop, but I would not be able to no matter how hard I tried. I could not erase that sound from my memory. I waited. My field of vision was clouded by blue, red, and yellow blemishes. I listened to the sound of its feet on dry forest floor, moving further and further away, until finally the sound was subdued by the chirp of crickets. I didn't kill it. I just drove it away. I drove it away just as God drove away Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The gash in my belly was not as deep as I had imagined, but the sight of my blood was nauseating. I took out the medkit from my bag. I smeared the wound in Raleigh salve, and then put some gauze over the wound and wrapped it in a bandage. I did not want to spend any more time than I needed there. I picked up my flashlight and my .38 and moved on. The beast was gone, but I angered it. Time went by like it did before, and like it would have done so after. I remember the throbbing pain in my ankle worsened the more I moved it. The pain was so intense it threatened to obliterate all thought. Sometime, a half hour later, as I came to the top of a steep slope, I felt as if the stone tablet had been lifted from my heart. 20, maybe 30 yards ahead of me, I saw a road gate, and beyond that was an asphalt surface. Civilization, I chanted in my head. I moved as fast as my body would allow, the agonizing pain pulsating through my joints and my muscles fired on all cylinders. As I got closer to the gate, I felt my body grow stiff. I stopped just a few feet away from the threshold of the forest. I looked back, and standing just 10 feet behind me in the center of the trail was the man in the black cassock. I was not sleeping this time, I knew that for sure. His hood was pulled back, his brow was furrowed, and his lips were pursed. He was smiling, so genuinely sweet with just the right touch of shyness, just like how Brian used to. On this face, it was a sign of bliss. My throat was dry and my chest felt tight. I turned back to see the man in the cassock as my eyes welled up with tears. I tried sniffing discreetly when I realized that a great passage in my life had come and gone. I did not cry then, but I would cry now. "I love you, Brian," I said aloud. Then I began walking back towards the road. I walked until the man in the cassock was recaptured by the darkness of the forest.